Okay, next item we have is elementary secondary, a portrait of a graduate. Mr. Verdine and Miss Vandentop. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Heidemann, Superintendent Law, members of the school board. Tonight, we're happy to bring back to you another look at a plan for Portrait of a Graduate. And in tonight's update, we'll go through some background and also a proposed process and work teams to continue with this work. So I'm going to turn things over to Ms. Vandentop, who's going to go through some of the history and kind of how we got up to this point so that we can anchor all of our work forward in that.
Good evening, Chair Heidemann, Superintendent Law, members of the board. Super excited to be here tonight to share our experiences through the 18-19 school year and the work we did with the tech plan and how it leads us to today. So during the 18-19 school year, we began to design our tech plan. And as we thought about our years past of providing access to the students and really building up those classrooms with the devices that the students needed, we wanted to shift our focus to more of the student experience and how those digital devices were providing a different experience for our students. And so we had conversations about that, and we decided that it was important for us to step out of the Anoka Hennepin School District and learn from others. And so we began to build teams, research teams, and have conversations about site visits. In those conversations, we engaged in conversations with neighboring school districts and asking if we could come and visit. Our focus was to really take a look at how they really are improving the student experience. And it wasn't necessarily about focusing on the devices, but more as the child's whole experience throughout their school day. So we built our teams, and as we connected with our staff members across our organization, it was so exciting to hear the passion and excitement that our staff had around joining us in this journey and being a part of this conversation and knowing that this was just the start. So we put together 3 research teams, and throughout the year last year, we went on many site visits. And during that time, we were able to not only see classrooms and connect with their flexible learning spaces, but we were also able to hear from student panels and talk to staff members and admin teams and talk about what this change looked like in their school district and how we could bring some of that back to Anoka Hennepin schools. In addition to our site visits, we also were able to go to the Target Dojo. And the first thing that we were introduced to at the Target Dojo was this thinking around agile thinking and this flexible mindset where just be open to change and newness. They sent us on a tour of their facility, and some of the things that our teams were really impressed with is how visible learning was. The entire site was covered with whiteboards. They had their staff contributing to all that learning and making it visible for everyone and leaving it up and talking about the impact it had on their teams. All voices mattered. It was just really wonderful to see how this concept that has really worked for Target was embraced by their staff. The Target Dojo talked about how their teams would book these spaces and come into these spaces, and they were just so excited, and the teams were so engaged in this process, and they were really happy with the results. As we finished our site visits and our Target Dojo visits, we asked ourselves, what is the next step? And we brought our research teams back together to reflect. And we talked with our research teams and recognized how great this opportunity was to visit these sites. But not only was it great, we were able to see all these parallels that were happening in our schools already. These flexible learning spaces were being built, these maker spaces, these opportunities for students to have a voice and a choice in their learning experiences. And so we prioritized next steps to be, what does our staff really want to do and move forward to focus on that learning experience for our students, which led us today.
Which led us to bringing forward to you the portrait of a graduate. I do want to, if you, I'll talk about it while you leave that slide up. Thank you. Okay, it's perfect. So one of the things that was interesting, and Ms. Hayes may be able to recall this, when we were in the Target Dojo, they were talking a little bit about the kind of person they want to hire. I think this is sort of an important story now that I think about it. I think about it a lot when we're working in our own schools. The reason I was saying Ms. Hayes may be able to recall this because I think you were thinking about your own children and what it takes for them to perhaps work in an environment that Target had. And one of the things that was interesting is they were sunsetting their requirement for a college diploma. And in that statement, they had made a few other things that I think were hints of something that's important for us to think about. One of the things they said, we ask every new employee 2 questions. One question is, what online community have you been a part of? And the second one is, how have you contributed to it? And I was thinking about that a lot because I thought, why would an organization ask those 2 questions of people coming into work for them? I think it's indicative of people who would come into their system and immediately be a contributor to their system because that's what they find themselves doing when they're not working. Anyway, it's sort of getting sort of an internal orientation from those individuals. Where do they spend their time? How do they contribute to a group? Because everything that they were doing was in teams at Target. And so you need people who are going to be forward about being a contributor and not just necessarily somebody who sits back and waits for other people to do things. So at any rate, we saw a lot of items here in our school district that would reinforce some of the work that we were seeing in other school districts. But the one thing that the research teams made up of our own teachers, some of our admin, and some other employees had felt strongly that would be a really good first step for us was to put together a portrait of a graduate process. And one of the reasons is because a lot of the things that we saw out in other school districts, they were a lot about the what. So we saw a lot of room renovations. We saw a lot of flexible learning spaces. We saw a lot of really interesting architecture, furniture, and a lot of things were a lot about the what. But I think when we saw school districts that had the portrait of the graduate work out front, we actually could see the why. So why would you invest in small spaces for students to work together? Well, maybe teamwork is one of your high leverage strategies, and you want to make sure that every kid is experiencing time in teamwork. I think the portrait of a graduate as a process gave for us probably the best first step in sort of ironing out the why. I think we have a lot of talk about 21st century learning. We talk a lot about educating the whole child. But the portrait of a graduate gets more specific then what does that really mean for students to be a 21st century graduate or that we're educating the whole child. This example comes from Jefferson County. It's one of many examples happening across the nation. I use Jefferson County. There's a couple things that I like about it. One, it's a very large system. So when we worked with our own staff, I think one item to hopefully kind of put to rest is a lot of people think, well, we're a bigger system, we can't do that. And Jefferson County is 101,000 students, and so roughly 2.5 times our size. And so large systems can do this. And the other thing that's actually impressive about this is it kind of morphed into their framework for their overall strategic plan. And so if you were to spend some time on Jefferson County's website, you'd find that this is a continuation of kind of how they speak and how they frame up their work, how they address their staff. So there was a lot to be impressed about this. This is one example of many portraits of a graduate versions that are out there. Many of them have some similarities to them, some differences. And some of the school districts we visited didn't necessarily have this document, but they were working on things like the 4 C's. So the 4 C's being critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creativity. And so there were school districts that didn't necessarily go through this process or have this, but they were focusing their work when it came to changing instruction and changing sort of how we work with kids, still building up their content mastery, but doing it in certain ways so that we're building up their creativity and other items. A portrait of a graduate in general is a process that is supported by a community-informed process. It addresses skills needed for a rapidly changing world and to make sure that students are ready for school, work, and life. As we'd mentioned, I think it's one of the challenges that we talked about a lot as a group is the idea that this isn't new. It really is kind of looking at things from a little bit different direction. But I thought as I was out and about and as we asked people to help us out with some photos, we'd take pictures of things that would kind of demonstrate that we are already doing many of the things. So This is Brookside Elementary School. What is out in front in the photo, you can see the glass movable walls. So the flexible space is a really, really important design element in almost all schools these days, so that if that wall's removed, you can use this for a lot of different purposes. Behind it, and I don't have a photo for that, is a makerspace. And so that's a common term you might be hearing frequently. Many of our schools use a space called a makerspace. I'd reference the Anoka High School one the last time that I did a presentation back in June. But our 2 new elementary schools were built with those too. We visited Crooked Lake Elementary School, and they do a makerspace. It's a very small thing, some robotics and a variety of things that kids can build with their hands. And in a first grade teacher's classroom, she had probably 3 or 4 kids' names on the wall, and it said that under makerspace. So I'd asked the teacher, I said, what's the purpose behind having that on there and having the students' names on there? She said, those are the students who, when they're done with their work, their reward can be to go down to the makerspace. And then she was saying to me that these are students that sometimes it's a little bit harder to get them to do their work, but because they get to go make something afterwards, because they get to go build something with their hands, they're much more engaged and apt to do the work. So she was happy to have that space down in the media center. The point, I think, whether you're looking at Anoka High School or Crooked Lake or the 2 new elementary schools, one thing that people are coming to realize is a lot of students actually enjoy building things, and they can work on content mastery skills while they're building them. The example that I used from Alexandria is they decided to combine house construction with geometry, because there are many students that learn geometry better if they're working with their hands and they can kind of see how geometry fits. And so it's one of the things that we've taken for granted, that sectioning everything off in schools seems to be the right way to do things, but sometimes things might need to be combined again too. At Andover High School, I was actually unaware. I knew we did additions, and I had a chance to go through here just last week. And this is a hallway that's out in one of the additions, and off to the side behind those glass walls, you can see some smaller spaces that kids have an opportunity to work together in. And in fact, I think in one of them, it's a little bit darker, but you can see the students working in that. So a variety of spaces, a variety of designs meant for larger groups in an open area, smaller groups in a quieter area, but variety built in, because it turns out that students actually like to try to pick some of the environment that they're going to work within and find out what works best for them. So again, I think one of the reasons why Portrait of a Graduate seems to me to be a really good idea is it validates so much current work that we have going on. So if we take spaces out of the picture, growth mindset work that we had going on, which many people, it makes a lot of sense that students would benefit from having a growth mindset. Leader in Me would be another example, and then some of the makerspace examples that I talked about before. But we have a lot going on in our district that is already supported by the work of Portrait of a Graduate. It just makes more sense when that piece of paper's in front of us. Real quickly to timeline and process then. I brought forward to the superintendent a plan for a timeline, a rough timeline, and then how this process may unfold. So we wanted to present that tonight, but basically 4 large steps: the planning part of the process, the longest part, which is actually conversations with a variety of groups of people to get input, a smaller part for designing a rough draft, and then finally a rough draft coming to the board for their input and adoption. So those will be the 4 large steps. The people that we would work with on the next slide. I would see this being, this would have benefit from using something a bit similar to the task force that worked on Fit for the Future. A small group at the central office that's helping the work move along, which would be an internal portrait team, about 8 to 10 people, flexible as needed. And then in the center, that portrait design team is sort of a larger community body that is going to be with this process through from beginning to end, and actually charged with designing a draft of that Portrait of a Graduate, made up of a variety of stakeholders for the system: parents and staff, community and business, and students. And then down below, those represent the stakeholder groups that we would have interactions with. We would likely need to design community nights to catch geographically a lot of the different stakeholder groups, but there are opportunities for us to meet with people where they already are. So PTO meetings is an example. There are several of us at the central office that are members of business communities, and so whether those are Rotary or the Metro Chamber North, there's options that we may be able to leverage in order to have conversations with a variety of stakeholders, and we would conduct similar conversations with them in feedback loops so that we could find out from these various stakeholders the types of skills that they would like to see us talk about and bring into a portrait of a graduate. So that is a process as I would draw it up. Again, pointing off to the right, the draft coming to the school board, and then feedback loops for school board and internal groups to be informed as the process moves along. And that's our draft presentation, our draft process, and overview of kind of the why and some of the background in terms of where we've been. And I'd be interested in questions you might have.
Superintendent Law.
Chair Heidemann, members of the board, several years ago, when we started our strategic planning process and we asked our employees about the initiatives we have in our scorecard, and we showed them our scorecard and all the different ways we look at ourselves and reflect on how we can get better, one of the disconnects our staff saw was not seeing themselves in the things that we measure. This board is a priority of providing rich opportunities for students. As we struggle with our high school 5-period day, our struggle is the fact that our students, as all of you have heard, love our elective options. And we balance not having full-year math courses or full-year literacy courses because we know our students tell us there are all the rich elective options that we provide. One of the things the Portrait of a Graduate will do will allow us to take all those skill sets that our community knows that we need out of our students and place those in different courses that we consider essential in our program. So every teacher can say, well, I teach an 8th grade arts class, and that is part of our Portrait of a Graduate. I fit here in how we've designed excellence. Or I teach in a makerspace, I'm part of the innovation that we have. Or I teach a business class, I'm part of the entrepreneurship. We have this in our system. We haven't quantified it. This will probably pull together a piece of why we know our community likes our elective-rich schedule that most districts don't have. Right. So just to put some pieces together on something that, as a superintendent, I've been trying to pull together for a few years, is how do we reflect the strength of our system? Yeah. Because we offer something very unique that most districts don't with our elective options. We know that it's got some challenges with math and literacy fluency, and we're working on that. But you saw tonight a taste, and Joel didn't share it, but he had written, like Amazon does, a press release for what the project will look like successfully when it's done, and it announces Anoka Hennepin rolls out a new Portrait of a Graduate to showcase their elective-rich schedule. So that's one of the pieces of what will this look like when it's done. And with that, I'd let the board go for questions.
Perfect. Any questions? Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Chair Heidemann. Thank you, Joel and Michelle. Just a couple comments. First of all, thank you for your team and the expanded teams that went out and conducted all of these visits and gathered the information and took the time to share their observations. The Target Dojo tour was really interesting, and the challenge for me during that time was how does this apply to Anoka Hennepin? How do we transfer what we're seeing and what we're hearing that businesses need to our schools? And a couple of the takeaways from that day was not that an advanced degree wasn't important, it was, but that it was one of the boxes that are checked, and it wasn't the ultimate determining boxes. That employers are looking beyond just a degree for employees that have experiences, that have interests, and that they can demonstrate that in other ways, which is exciting to hear because the traditional education path does not work for every student. But that doesn't mean that every student doesn't have the ambitions to work at high levels of work. So it was exciting to hear that and to see that. The other takeaway for me that day was on those whiteboards that Michelle mentioned, that they talked about their old system was this group was here and this group was there, and there was no conversation between. So when a challenge came up, it was this up and down and back and forth with very little crossover. And what the dojo did was brought the pieces together. They solved problems faster, and they were able to implement solutions for their staff and their consumers quicker. And it was just a great lesson in kind of looking at things differently to make the pieces work for everyone. And I see two pieces of what Anoka Hennepin is doing at Coon Rapids High School with the biomed and the community partners and the business partners that are part of that initiative to serve the students and support the staff. But, you know, even today's paper talks about there's just a desperate need in the airline industry for people to have the skills to support the needs. And what's our responsibility? What does Anoka Hennepin have to do with solving that problem? So I appreciate the forward thought, the ideas of how do we look outside our boundaries? How do we partner with businesses and industries that need our students, and we need their support to help us get there? So again, thank you. And it's exciting to think differently. It can be a little scary too, and a little intimidating, because as we've heard from the Secondary Math Committee, our students today aren't learning math the way that we learned math and our parents learned math. But it is exciting to move forward and make sure that our students are ready for the future that needs them. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I also find it exciting. I'm glad that Superintendent Law talked a little bit about what we might use it for, and I think that's where my question goes. So once we have this portrait of an Anoka Hennepin graduate, where does it go from there? So like, do we use it to say the courses we're offering meet what the portrait of the graduate and go towards that? Do we look at our graduates and say, yes, we're meeting what they need? I'm just curious about kind of how it fits into what we currently do.
Superintendent Law.
We're wading into this, but I see it as along with these are the courses you need to take to graduate from Anoka Hennepin. These are the experiences you need to track through in order for us to guarantee that our graduates have this skill set, they need to look and say, where did I meet this creativity and innovation? And it might be a reframing of what we require in credits, or it might be a separate checklist that we put with students to say, you know, you really haven't had a whole lot of exposure to entrepreneurship in your experience. What I would see us coming back is auditing our current program and saying, where are we doing this well, and where do we have significant gaps? And bring it to the board and make board recommendations, or let the board weigh in on how we might look at that. Similar to how we do standards review or materials adoption process to say, here are the new standards, here's how we're covering it, here's where we have gaps. Either our current materials meet those expectations, or we're going to need something different.
I would imagine it's going to be something that develops over time, but it's really what we've talked about is the whole child. How do you define the whole child, and how do all the pieces that we offer in Anoka Hennepin fit into that? Instead of being so focused on MCA test scores and MAP scores and, you know, those type of measures, we can get lost in what happens to the whole child, right? Mm-hmm. So this is an opportunity to define that and then make sure that we align to it. I think it's going to be something we'll be working on for 2, 3, 4 years, I would imagine, as we go forward. But I think the starting point is to define it, right? What do we want to have? And I think that's where we're starting. What is it? And then we can go to the next step of how does our organization align and support what kids need as a whole child.
And just to echo something, I don't want our community to lose the message. We expect students who are literacy and math fluent.
Yes.
And this other skill set. We're not going to drop our expectation that all of our students graduate as readers and confident math students. But beyond that, we have this other skill set. So you're, like you said.
I'm hoping
those
I
things-
didn't imply that, but
No,
yes, we want to
no,
make sure that
you
we do
didn't, but
well in the
that's the
academic.
first thing that people get critical of is, oh, they don't care about kids being able to read. We'll never drop those things.
Right.
But we're always looking for ways to have the whole child.
Yeah. Any other questions? Excellent work. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to give board members a choice here. Would you like to take a 10-minute recess? Keep going? Okay, we're going to keep going. Ms. Vargas?